Hey there, it's Corey of Send Smarter Intervention, where we make research-based reading intervention easy. And today we're here to talk about analyzing your literacy intervention data, my absolute favorite thing to do in intervention. Here's the thing, it really doesn't have to be as complicated as we often make it out to be. And it's critical that we can do this effectively because this is how we create the most effective lessons for our students that are going to get them the results we know they're capable of. So here's the thing. As literacy interventionists, special educators, speech language pathologists, anybody supporting struggling readers, one of the challenges we face is that we have to figure out how to track and analyze data quickly. We have students in front of us that we are providing activities and intervention and doing all the things. And we need to figure out how we're going to analyze data as we're going so that we can drive their instruction forward. We also have the challenge of knowing what the data is actually telling us. There's a lot of mistakes that we make in terms of thinking the data means something that it doesn't. So we'll get into that. Additionally, we need to make sure that we are using data to drive our lesson planning. And so one of the challenges is figuring out how to use the data to actually drive or target those lesson plans. One of the mistakes that we often see well-meaning educators making is that we're spending way too long trying to make sense of our data. Sometimes it just feels like we are inundated with data that we are not really sure what to do with. And so we need to make sure that our data is clear, it is concise, and that we are not spending a ton of time trying to make sense of it. Another big mistake that we see educators making is that we're making the data personal. Here's the thing, data means nothing about you. It means nothing about your worth as an educator. It means nothing about how effective you are in your intervention. And unfortunately, because we've been put in a situation where we have performance driven metrics, or the data is really meant to determine whether or not teachers or speech language pathologists are effective in their jobs. When we look at pay for performance, or when we look at teachers getting raises or their performance reviews being stuck to the data, we start making the data personal. And here's the thing, the data is not personal. It's not personal at all. It is a tool, and that tool is going to provide us with this information that is absolutely critical to get students the results that they need. So the data is not about us. The data is about what our students need to be able to continue to close the gap, to continue to meet that next milestone. And when we make data personal, when we get all in our stuff about it, then what happens is we can't see the tool for what it really is. And so we have to stop making the data personal so that we can approach it. Because when we make the data personal, we have a tendency to avoid it. I don't want to look at it. I don't want to have to view myself through this lens. And so it's really critical that we are not making the data personal. Another thing that we often see happening is that we're not using the data we have to drive our lessons or to target our instruction. Instead, what we see really well-meaning educators doing is taking a look at data and saying, great, this is where my students did well, or this is where I did well, this is where the intervention did well, and really just moving on from there. We can't look at data as something that just gives us information about the past. What we have to do instead is look at the data as providing us with something that we can use forward facing, right? So what is that data telling us about where we go next, as opposed to what happened in the past? Because what happened in the past is in the past, and we can use that information to know, great, this is working, this isn't working. Again, we're removing ourselves. However, we can definitely use the information it's giving us to move forward. The bottom line is that analyzing our data does not need to be complicated or personal, and we have to analyze data in order to be as effective as possible in our intervention. Why? because data drives effective intervention. That's it. When you have data, you are going to have the most effective intervention and you are going to get results in the fastest amount of time possible for your students because you're providing what they need as opposed to following what a curriculum says they need or going through an entire program when perhaps they only need pieces of that intervention. We have to be really careful about looking at the students in front of us and using our knowledge and pairing those two things to get the best results possible. Because here's the thing, if we don't analyze our data, we may be literally throwing spaghetti against a wall, trying to pick activities for our students. Hope that sticks. Maybe that'll stick. Maybe that'll stick. And we don't want to be doing that. We want to know what our students need in order to give them exactly the activities that are going to close the gap or going to get them to that next milestone. Because here's the thing, throwing intervention activities at the wall hoping they stick is one thing, because sometimes they actually do. You feel pretty great in those moments. You're like, yes, that session was awesome. And other times you're like, wow, that was not awesome. And that totally happens. However, if we're not analyzing data, the worst case scenario is that our students aren't making growth at all, or they're not making growth in specific areas. So several years ago, I was using an evidence-based curriculum and I was following it. I was doing progress monitoring every 6 to 12 months as was indicated. And essentially I felt like, great, everything is going fine. But unfortunately, what I ended up recognizing later was that some of my students had some really significant holes and gaps in their language knowledge, in their vocabulary development, in their comprehension ability. And unfortunately, because of the evidence-based program I was using, I wasn't really targeting those specific areas. And so my students' phonics growth, which this particular program hit very heavily, was growing, but it didn't last. It didn't last. And it didn't last because I didn't target all of the areas that she needed to be able to close the gap because I just didn't have the data. And I wasn't analyzing the data consistently. I was analyzing it every 6 months or every year. That's just not enough. So how on earth do we do this without spending a ton of time? Because we know that you don't have more time. That's not something that any of us have. So one of the things that we need to do is we need to make sure we're building our data tracking into our sessions. We talked about this last time, and so definitely go take a look at that if you want to review. However, we need to make sure that we are tracking data in our sessions. We are setting up our sessions to allow data tracking to be easy. So for example, we may have a list of students where we are tracking just on different dates. Or for example, we may have Brooke and Gretchen where we are tracking both of them on the 13th. We have students that we're going to track on the same day, or we're going to focus on students on different days. And we're going to make sure that we are filling out our data tracking so that we can be really clear where there are holes, where there are gaps. And this is just something we build right into our sessions. Again, take a look back at that last training. We're going to tell you all about how to set up your sessions so that you can make this really easy. So once you have that data, once we have the data that we've taken within our sessions, for example, this would be our phonological awareness data tracking session, we would go then input that data into a data tracking tool. We have an awesome Excel spreadsheet tool that we absolutely love that we're going to give you access to as well so that you can use this as well. But essentially what you're going to do is you are going to put in the skills that you're tracking for each student. So we create a tab in our Excel spreadsheet for each student. Then we input each of the goals that that student may be working on. We'll put each of the trials here. Sometimes you may have multiple trials in one day. Sometimes you may have trials over multiple weeks or multiple months. And so essentially what you're going to do is you are going to mark how many did the student get correct, out of how many trials did you give. This is going to provide you with your percent accuracy. So oftentimes what you see in terms of goals and well-written goals is that we may see something like, student will achieve 90% accuracy or better on sentence segmenting in 4 out of 5 trials. That's great. That is a fantastic goal, and we can definitely stick with that. One of the things that we like to do is we like to word that goal just a little bit differently, such that we might say, student will achieve 90% accuracy over an average of trials with a minimum of 5 trials. And then what the spreadsheet will do is, as we're entering in the student's data, this number is changing based on what the average is out of the number of sessions or trials that have been provided. And in this case, the goal is set to 90% accuracy or better. And so what we see is we see a change here in whether or not the students are reaching their goals. And so, for example, sentence segmenting for this particular student is not meeting the goal. And so it's showing up red, and that is conditional formatting to show I need to give more sentence segmenting tasks. Or with the auditory discrimination, okay, over time, it looks like they're doing really great. I don't necessarily need to give more auditory discrimination tasks. This is going to be a great way to know where do you need to focus. Which students do you need to be providing with which type of questions? So the bottom line is that in order to have data that you can analyze, that you can really do something within your sessions, you need to be getting pretty granular, and you need to have activities that are providing you with this opportunity to measure over time. And this should be just part of your session. This is not separate progress monitoring. This is not separate tools. This is using the activities that you're already giving in your sessions. So for example, if we were looking at phonics and we're having students read a word list, you're literally just seeing how many words did they read correctly out of how many words did they have in that particular session. This does not have to be separate from your regular sessions, but it does need to be something that we're looking at accurately and over time. So sometimes you might see students who in the beginning actually seem to be doing pretty well, and then sometimes those skills start to drop off. So we cannot assume that just because a student at one point was doing great with something, that they continue to do great with that. We need to make sure that we're doing consistent check-ins to see how our students are doing. And you should have every activity within your session be something that you could be tracking data on. That doesn't mean you have to be tracking data, but you should be able to for every single activity that you're giving, so that over time you can start to look at this, and then you can provide these spreadsheets and graphs to your students' parents, to your students themselves, to your administration, so that you can really start to show where that growth is. And we're going to talk more about that in our next lesson. So definitely hang in there with us. So here's the thing. We use the tracking system to know specifically which activities am I pulling for my students. And again, we're always checking back in, because just because students were good at it at one point does not mean that that ability doesn't kind of dip and rise. And again, that has nothing to do with us. It has nothing to do with our intervention. It's just normal student development. And so we just need to be watching it over time. Students need change, okay? So we need to be constantly tracking and analyzing. The needs will change. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident do you feel analyzing your students' data? If you score below a 7, is it because you don't have the data you need, or you have the data, but you don't have a tool that's going to help provide clarity on the analysis of that data? If it's the second, we have this great tool that we're going to share with you that we're so excited about. So hopefully that can alleviate any possible worry. We don't think you should ever worry about your intervention. You're doing great, but it's a really great tool that can definitely alleviate any time spent trying to put something together yourself. If you have any questions, let us know. Drop them in the comments. We'd love to open up a discussion about this. Next up, we're going to be talking all about sharing your data easily with parents, administrators, and students.